I was born in San Francisco in January of 1930. Went to elementary school there and went to high school there, and then came up to Oregon State to take forestry. My dad is a Dutch immigrant from Amsterdam, and my mother is a first-generation Italian. And that is a combination that has worked well. I was all set to go to the University of California, take forestry there. A good friend of mine said, why don't we go up and play basketball at Oregon State? He was a varsity player, and I had played some. And he said they have an excellent forestry school, so I said, okay, that sounds good to me. And as I was on the train, he was running alongside, waving goodbye, as he had gotten a scholarship to St. Mary's. I almost got off in Eugene, but finally made it to Corvallis and got transported to the dormitory and went from there. Actually came in the spring of '47, and was my first class card. Read the class of '51, but I basically was really class of '52. I had had a lot of great outdoor experiences with our scout troop down in San Francisco. We came up to Oregon, and that probably fostered my feeling about being in the outdoors. I think a lot of people that get into forestry think about the fact that they're going to be sitting on a horse looking into the sunset over the trees, and that it gets quickly changed as you get into the forestry to find out, that it's really got quite a lot of variety to the profession, and it's not an easy profession. I started out in forest management, and after a summer of hotshot crew firefighting and also setting chokers out in the woods, I decided that forest products on the business side was a little bit more appealing to me than the forest management side. Well, at the end of my career, I was commissioned as an officer in the Corps of Engineers, and I went to first to some basic training back at Fort Belvoir, and then back out to Fort Lewis, and then over to Germany, and served in Heidelberg area from 1953 through February 1955. Came back, decided I'd start working on a master's degree at Oregon State. With a young wife and our first child. Were born that very first year back. One of the professors left the department. We were only a 3-person department. A very small portion of the department, and I was asked to do part-time teaching while I was working on my master's, and basically stayed in teaching and the entire time, except for a short stint at Bohemia Lumber Company to help build a plywood plant. I taught just about every course in the department over the period of years I was there, starting with basic wood technology, which is the identification and the use of wood. We have wood utilization, wood properties, wood timber mechanics, plywood manufacturing, pulp and paper area. All of those were part of our curriculum, with a high emphasis on the scientific part of wood science, which is really the basis of forest products. And then we also get involved in the manufacturing end of everything from lumber through plywood and particle board and the pulp and paper industry. Teaching career began in September of 1955, taught for 35 years. Oregon State School of Forestry, has always had a very, very large national standing in both research and its outreach. In '63, I became the first forest products extension specialist in Oregon, and I did that for 8 years through 1970. And during that time, our major mission was not only to take the research that was being done at the Forest Products Laboratory out to the field, which was considerable. The Forest Laboratory had been there for quite a while, and our job was to basically take that information out and get it so it can be used, and also to find out what kind of problems the industry was having. At that time, we had over 500 sawmills in the state. We had over 100 plywood plants. We had about 10 pulp paper plants. So the industry was quite vigorous at that time. They were cutting around 8 billion board feet a year. And the needs were great, and surprisingly enough, the biggest vacuum was in the managerial area. And that was where I really concentrated a lot of my efforts. I really almost was teaching a lot of business type courses to the industry as well as basic wood technology. We put on courses all over the state, primarily teaching them why wood acts the way it does so they can see what happens to it in the mill, but also what kind of things needed to be done to become better managers of the industry, which was very badly needed. The laboratory had a very good reputation. We learned very quickly in the extension job to take the symbol off the side of the car because he immediately thought we were tax collectors. And so, you know, I'm here from the government to help you was something that they had well in their mind. So we had to sort of really make friends with them and tell them, you know, we're really here to give any help we can to the industry. Basically, we were raising a family. I was teaching still half-time, which at Oregon State usually means a couple of courses a term besides doing the half-time extension work. Both masters wanted around 75% of your time, but that's normal when you're in those split jobs. Oh yeah, made several in that Willamette, in Weyerhaeuser, in Bohemia, down in the valley at Medford at the old Elk Lumber Company. Mr. Flanagan, some of those. We got to know a lot of those people very well by working with them. Bohemia became through Larry Chapman primarily. I had known from the year I'd been there before. They went at 59. I went up there to help build the plywood plant. Larry Chapman was a very, very progressive individual in that organization about continuing education for the people in his organization. And so I worked with them very extensively. Willamette Industries put on a lot of courses for their workers, both in the Dallas plant, well, more to the Sweet Home organization. One of the things that became a realization is that the whole teaching profession was changing. In 1968, we took probably the only leave of absence or sabbatical leave, and I went back to Michigan State to get a PhD in wood industry management. And that was quite a change to take 4 kids back to little tykes, back to Michigan with our Volkswagen bus and our trailer behind through Montana and down through the northern peninsula and into Michigan State, which is a humongous university. And we were there a year and a summer. Did a study of sawmill managers and how they use their time. That was my thesis. Then came back, and then the basic decision was really whether to continue on at that time with extension work or try to spend a little bit more time off the road and spend at home. And at that time I was asked to go down to help out at the placement center. The university was establishing a new career placement center. Lou Edwards from the business school wanted me to come down and handle engineering and forestry. So I still continued half-time teaching and then shifted over to that at that period of time in 1970. Then in 1974, actually probably tail end of 1973, early 74, 2 friends of mine came up and said, would you be interested in looking at running for the legislature, which I told them they were stark raving mad. One person that worked for a very large lumber corporation and I had been in college with, and he said, you know, forest taxation is going to come up in the 74 legislature, or 75 legislature, and there had not been anybody in there since 1969 when Stubb Stewart was in there and worked on the same thing. He says it needs to be revamped. We basically have an old ad valorem tax system, which you pay taxes every year, and if you lose your timber and everything, tough luck. It needs to go to a yield type system, and he says very few people in the legislature know anything about that. And I said, well, I'll ponder that. And then another good friend of mine I had been in forest products with, Chuck and Mary Burroughs, and Mary was in the legislature at that particular time, said, well, we ought to give it really strong thought. Here are the kinds of things that you're going to have to do and to get elected, and you'd have a lot of fun being in there, and so on and so on. And that's how I got started. I had not ever considered the legislature. I had not been involved in any local politics whatsoever, other than on the fringes maybe of somebody saying, would you support us in this particular area or in that particular area. So I had not had any experience whatsoever. Well, I was pretty familiar with the issues of those issues. I don't think I was anywhere aware of what the complexity of all the issues were that were going to show up in the legislative process. I immediately, the seat was being vacated, for one thing, by Bob Ingalls, which an open seat was much more attractive to go after than go after an incumbent. And so I immediately went down and made acquaintance with Bob, who later became a very, very close friend and really was my mentor whenever there were tough times in the legislative process. I always went down and talked to Bob because he had a very good feel on politics in general. He'd been a very good legislator and well respected from Corvallis. And I hadn't known him before, but became a great admirer of him, and we really became very close friends. And he gave me some pretty good perspective on what it was like. Well, I was a Republican at that time, and if you knew Corvallis politics going back to the 50s, basically it was a Republican stronghold. If you ever wanted to have any vote at all in Corvallis during that time, you had to be a registered Republican. So I became a registered Republican. And Bob was a Republican. The shift began to take place probably dramatically before the Nixon event, which didn't help Republicans out very much during that time, but there was a shift over in Corvallis over a period of time in which the Democrats and Republicans basically became almost even, with a very strong group of independents in the thing, and it remains that way today, with a tremendous, one of the highest percentage of independents of any district in the state, until they did the redistricting this time, which I don't know what it's like, but it was about 25% independent. And so that shift took place, and at that moment in the time, the Democrats were trying to make a real run again at gaining some power. And my very first election was my very toughest election. I came in late to the game. We ran a very aggressive campaign, from getting out a lot of people, doing a lot of door knocking, and doing a lot of publicity. He had a early lead, a substantial early lead, and was also running a very aggressive campaign. That was Dave Smeedema. And he was an attorney in town, and a great guy, really. And it was a clean campaign, but it was very aggressive. We didn't know until the wee hours of the morning that we had won that election by a couple hundred votes. That was the closest election ever. I basically had a kitchen cabinet, and I pretty much ran my own. In Corvallis, parties do not, the Democratic Party is very well organized. The Republican Party was organized, but not as great a help. It was really very much on individual people you knew to put together. You got some help, but not a lot. And at that time, contributions or anything like that were mostly small contributions, and we limited campaign contributions anyway, all the way along through my entire 20 years. We kept them relatively small. A lot of help at that time was coming from the state and from people in the House who were Republicans that wanted, this was the Nixon time. Not very many Republicans got elected in 1974 to the Oregon House. Dave Frohnmeyer and I were, I think, the only two. There might have been one other, I can't remember. So we were sort of, got a lot of assistance from the people in the caucus, which was down to a rousing 22 people, okay? Because the Democrats had taken over the legislature in 1973 with a very whopping amount. This was the time that what we called the Young Turks came in, Vera and Earl Blumenauer and Gustafson and all of those, and they were looking for some major changes in the legislative process. Republicans basically were a very small but hearty bunch, and a very good bunch. I was really impressed with the group I came in with. Roger Martin was our leader, and we had Norma Paulus was in there, and so we had just a real super Bill Gwynn from Albany, who I got to know very well. And I think what I enjoyed most about it is it was really a debating society. In all the years that I was under that leadership with Roger, and later on under Gary Wilhelms and so on, when issues came up, we didn't have a lot of axes to grind. We had some things that we would go to war on, okay? But on the real key issues, we were allowed to state very clearly pros and cons inside the caucus. We would debate an issue out. And then the final thing was, well, you vote your own conscience on that particular bill. And knowing that we all came from various kinds of districts that had different opinions about issues. And I respected that, because it was not, if you aren't with us, you're against type of psychology, which started to come in the late 90s, or early 90s, actually in the early 90s. And that really operated for most of those years, from I'd say 1975 up through maybe 87, right in there, 89. And I enjoyed that particular approach to it. Of course, on some procedural things, caucuses will stick together on procedural House votes, but on major issues, it was not. And I think they took a great pride of the fact that they had worked on the bottle bill. They were more moderate in their approach to a lot of the issues. While being fiscally conservative, they were also very much involved, like Sam Johnson, with the initiation of the Homeowners and Renters Relief Program, programs that they had worked with colleagues across the aisle on. And I think there was, on big issues, a tendency to be more moderate and bipartisan. The R that was tattooed on us was a small r rather than a large R. You know, you didn't feel that the Republican thing was something that you would do or die, but mainly it was something that represented a particular philosophy. Well, Corvallis is a very unique district. One is it is a district that people do pay attention to politics. They do pay attention to issues. They are not afraid to talk to you about them. They knew I was from the campus, and of course the business community was always somewhat edgy on the town gown type of situation, but basically I worked with them very closely to make sure that they knew that I was representing everybody and not just the interest of a single university, of which in many cases I had to take some tough stances even in budget situations and trying to make sure that everything was dealt with fairly. They are not afraid to catch you in Bi-Mart or the grocery store and tell you their opinion. You felt often like you ought to dress with an incognito with a large wig and try to miss people because you could not get out of a store in less than an hour by bumping into people who had their opinions about various issues, which I liked. Yeah, that's what it was all about. You know, that's being a citizen legislature, and that came with the territory, and I think Corvallis was a great district to represent from that standpoint. Local press was Gazette Times, one newspaper, so we had to deal with one, and Bill Bradley there very definitely made sure that The publisher's opinions were not being represented only in the newspaper, and so he took extra effort to make sure that the legislature was kept on the straight and narrow, and some of the other reporters did too, but they were very fair. Never had any real problem. Got along with the press fine. I wrote some of them down because it's really interesting to see how similar. Remember, Tom McCall's going out of office, and a new governor is coming in. Bob Straub is coming in. And at that particular time, the same things were being talked about a lot today that are talked about today. We were involved in school finance, but at that time it was basically one of trying to make sure that the formula for distribution was fair. We had a great revenue officer here in Richmond who was absolutely outstanding. Probably the best teacher that I've had in economics in all the years. He really guided a lot of legislators through some tough waters. So fine-tuning homeowners and renters relief, some of the women's issues, such as estate planning, was a key issue. Field burning was a volatile one. Fluoridation was a volatile issue. People screaming from the balconies at Representative Kinsey for the fact that he voted for fluoridation for Portland, and they had to take her out by police escort. And it was, if there was ever an emotional issue, that was one. ERA, we basically were arguing over that, and the Oregon legislature overwhelmingly approved the ERA amendment. So those were some of the key issues. Well, a lot of Oregonians didn't like land use planning at all. At that time, there was still groups of people who basically would have liked to have gotten rid of land use planning. It's very interesting. A lot of Republicans, of which I was one of them, that supported land use planning because of the long-range implication it had in the development of the state and the use of its resources. That hasn't changed much, except that there has been more vigorous opposition coming along and nibbling away at the edges of land use planning. Now, as population grows, you're faced with the dilemma that land becomes more precious, and as that becomes more precious, prices go up for that land, and consequently it probably has been somewhat of a contributor to higher cost of housing and things along the line. But that's a trade-off you pay for trying to at least have some kind of orderly growth. One of the big battles that was along at that time was where growth should take place. And I can't remember whether it was in 75 session or the 77 session, those two sessions I served on revenue, that one of the issues that I had been asked to try to solve with one of the Democratic colleagues was how to keep speculation out of land use. One of the big drawbacks was that if you were to allow growth in an area, how could you keep land speculation from taking place that was just rewarding those people who were speculating in it? This was particularly aimed at farmers that were elderly farmers that wanted to sell their land, and how could they go about doing it? We couldn't resolve that issue. That was a tough issue, was how to keep speculation out of the process. So basically we had a big fight going into North Albany, of which LB Day had to come down and solve, with a high pollution problem in the groundwater from septic systems. And that was a battlefield, and it got the land use got a real test in that particular area. It was a great revenue committee. If you like to get up here at 7 o'clock in the morning under Earl Blumenauer, who decided that we should be acting a little bit like the French Foreign Legion in discipline, and in order to make Republicans get up early, he thought that he'd get us here at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he would have night meetings also in which we didn't get home. So, but he was a tough chair, but it was a great committee. Hardy Myers, Bob Marks, Paul Walden, Norma Paulus, Wally Priestley, myself, and we had some real ding-dong arguments in there about taxation. But we did get some things. Timber tax came up at that time. Did not get resolved until the 77 session. We were able to basically start to work on some compromises at the tail end of that session. The big issue at that time was the revamping of the school finance formula, but also we worked on some very interesting things. We worked on the historic property bill, which was trying to preserve historic property. That was one of Norma's things. We were working on how would you have legislation if somebody was to grow a tree in front of your house on solar, trying to deprive you of sunshine type of things, which you would think was, I don't think we ever really resolved that one. We worked at that time on taxation. We started our work on estate taxation. We felt that women were we have a very strong women's particular group in the legislature at that time, led by Mary Reiki and Norma and Mary Burroughs and Vera, some of those, and they were worried about the fact that estate taxes were being very unfair to widows and surviving children. So we went to work on that and got a good bill put together. I think we got that out in 77, but we started work. But those were the main things, and timber tax took up a huge amount of time. A lot of testimony, pro and con, experts coming in from all sides of the field, and a lot of economists involved. And the idea was that we wanted to move to a yield tax the timber at the time it's cut, try to maintain some fair level of taxation on the land itself, and the difference between the east side and the west side of the timber, which is different types of timber types, and also what would be a fair taxation, and it was the level, it was the battleground. Earl and his colleagues wanted very high percentage. Republicans basically wanted about 6 to 7%. Wasn't resolved until the 77 session. It was resolved at a figure, I think, around 7.5, right in there. Finally, just the realization that you were on a fine edge of putting people out of business in the small timberland area if you went too high, and if you went too low, you probably weren't being fair. And I think the reason that it was being pushed at a higher percentage was knowing that they had to come back down and compromise at a middle ground. I always have felt that one of the big differences there was that, Earl and I we were the two major adversaries on that particular measure, but we gained a great deal of respect and became close friends afterwards, was the fact that you could battle on the House floor and you could win a battle, but you still maintained a greater interest in the greater good sort of thing, a real congeniality between friend and foe, so to speak, in the House chamber. Well, at first we didn't work together very well at all. Later on, I think there was started to be a grudgingly work together, and then finally we started to sort of hammer out, and this was a committee process, of which then had to be fought out on the floor, and even then there were minority reports to try to throw it back the other direction, and had to be defeated. Large floor presentations with what it would do to the timber industry and so on, and what the taxation was and the differences. It was almost a course in forest economics. And so we have finally, I think, because in this particular case, the Republicans basically also had some Democrats that represented timber districts that were quite concerned, especially along the coast. So it became a bipartisan thing. A lot of that gets crafted in legislative council with a lot of help from the staff, Rich Munn's staff. And I think Rich probably played a tremendous role on keeping us on target, not letting us drift too far apart, and as well as offering all the services available to try to arrive at a good bill. And so that helped. I worked on going from revenue, which was a great assignment, a great starting assignment for a young legislator, because you not only saw the taxation side, you learned a little bit about income taxes and things along those lines, and exemption as well. It was the first time that we ran up to the exemption for people who had been in, well, let's see, it was the age exemption for people that I think it was $3,500 or something like that, and that became a very large argument. But anyway, go back to the original question. Working with the staff of both revenue and then going over to Ways and Means Committee for 17 years, you develop a very close relationship with staff members, because they are the ones that basically do an awful lot of the research. And they try exceedingly hard not to impose their own opinions on you. And you've got to take that information and you've got to basically put it through the crucible of study and get pros and cons on all of the sides of a particular issue before you make up your mind. But staff was, in those particular areas, is two very important staffs. The other one that's very important is legislative counsel. So if you talk about three major staffs in the legislature, those are the three major ones. The rest of the committees are basically staffed by people who get chosen each session. And they're usually chosen by people who put their names in the hopper, and sometimes by political affiliation and so on down the line. And their work is not quite as heady as it is on those three areas. Well, I don't know if the only change I can recognize is that we have an awful lot of new faces in those staffs now. There's been almost a complete turnover in legislative fiscal. There's been a very large turnover in legislative counsel. And legislative revenue has had a couple of major turnovers in it. I think there's only one person there that was there when I started out in Revenue Committee, and that's Myers. We have legislators who were determined that the staff ought to come up with an answer that agrees with them. Okay, you always find those in the legislative process. They come down and they beat on staff. If they don't get the answer the way they want it, they want the staff to figure out why they can't get the answer the way they want it. And staff has a great deal of problem with that. That's a tough job for them to dance along the tight wire and not yield to that kind of nonsense. But we do have legislators that, for various reasons, do that. And they get well known. They get known who those folks are, and they basically lose some credibility. Well, I would have to say that Hardy Myers was very influential. He was extremely fair-minded, probably almost to a fault by some of his colleagues who probably thought that he wasn't partisan enough, but Hardy was very good. Of course, I got to know Roger Martin very well, and I thought he had done an excellent job. Gary Wilhelms on our side of the alley. I got to be good friends with Paul Hanneman. Denny Jones later on, really not during those first 3 years. I would also include Vera Katz in that, because I ended up with being on a lot of committees with her in the Ways and Means. Mainly, why they could be partisan, they at the same time were extremely fair-minded. That is, that they would work for the good. That if there was something that basically affected Oregon so dramatically that they saw the issue was beyond party politics, they would do that. And I think that's the key to some of the real good legislators. Jason Bowe would have to be put in that category. Vliet would have to be put in that category in the Senate side. I would certainly put Kip Lombard down from the Medford area. We lost Bill Gwynn, which was, and Lloyd Kinsey, who left relatively early in my legislative career, which I had great respect for, and there was, my mind's slipping as far as memory, he was an attorney from down in the Roseburg area. But those are a few. I'm trying to think of some on the Democratic side. Harvey Atkinson was always sort of a character, really, in many ways, but he held a powerful position in Ways and Means those first years. But I sat behind him, and he was certainly interested. And the loss of Mary Reekie hurt the legislature process considerably. Certainly, Mary Burroughs was a good, solid legislator. Deb's pop stayed, and I felt Deb's was one that, and Tony Meeker was another that we often had a lot of things to do with in the legislative process. I think most of those folks basically held a great deal of respect on both sides. Len, for one, developed a very good grasp of the budgeting process, but Len has got a reputation of being a very fair-minded individual. And he tries to work for the good of the state very seriously. I think it was difficult for Len under some situations to work in the particular caucuses that he's had. Okay. But I think he's done a very good job at maintaining over a long period of time that kind of respect. May Yee built her reputation primarily on her constituent work in her district, more than probably on her legislative efforts. Well, I think an awful lot of the Republicans in office, especially people like Norma Paulus and such, who had had close relationships with Tom McCall and had a high respect for him, and also Mark Hatfield and Bob Paquin. Dorchester Conference was, at that time, an outstanding event from the standpoint of for moderate Republicans in the state. Tom was looked at very much almost like an icon from the standpoint of being the kind of Oregonian that everybody would like to be like. So I think that when Bob Straub came along, Bob was respected. He wasn't kind of flashy personality that Tom McCall was, and probably suffered from that to a certain extent. But I think he probably is not given credit for a lot of the good things that he did as state treasurer, and I think he had a very tough time as governor. Vliet saw us through those terrible years like these folks are doing, although I think we went something like 10 special sessions in a period of 1980 through 1985, 87, somewhere in there. We were always the first cut, and then the first, and then the next, and the next. We were in that very first sweep, we were cutting something like $600 million out of a $2.3 billion budget. We couldn't do it. We simply couldn't do it. We robbed every tin can there was for $300 million, and finally, and one of those tin cans turned to come back and bite us because we were told it was legal and that it was excess funds that weren't going to be used. But at any rate, we finally had to pass a surtax to take care of the rest. That took a lot of work. I think of all the people from the standpoint of of appreciating a real manager. Vliet came close to being what I would call an excellent manager during that particular time. He worked with both sides, was very nonpartisan. We knew what the troubles were. The leaderships of the and several layers of leadership of each of the caucuses were often called in and talked about particular problems. He certainly paid attention to the Republican caucus, but at the same time gave a lot of attention to the Democrats too. We knew basically that you couldn't nickel and dime this thing forever. Somewhere along the line there was going to have to be a major tax reform, and of course that was a time that Peter Courtney and I wrote the sales tax bill. Bullet holes didn't heal up for a lot of years after that one. But at any rate, when we first brought it into the Revenue Committee in the summer, we were told we were almost stark raving mad. This would have been the summer of '80. Okay, we brought the traditional three-legged stool in and gave our presentation, and Peter and I joined forces and actually locked ourselves in with Rich Munn with no lobbyist around, no influence at all, and wrote the sales tax bill with Barbara Seymour, who is probably the best tax person on sales taxes across the United States in our legislative council. And she did the grunt work on that. And we then stood back and withstood all the snapping turtles that came up on the beach and tried to take care of all of the little detail stuff. But that bill basically was the same bill that came along in '83 and the same bill that Barbara used in '85. There wasn't much changes to the language in it. So it had been crafted pretty well. And if that had been in effect, I doubt if we'd be where we are right now. But anyway, we went through the first time with Senator Fadley basically torpedoed us the first time with that measure, and then we finally came back and put it out to the public. We got it passed through the House by one vote. We put it out to the public. Vliet did, decided that we would try to see if the public would agree with it. I think it was the '83 election. And of course that had that hardcore anti-sales tax group rise up out of the trenches and basically did a number on it. People basically have great trouble understanding what a sales tax or any taxation measure does, because taxation is so darn complicated. It even takes us a long time to understand it here. I think the old saw about the fact that it was going to tax things that it really wasn't going to tax, but it made good rhetoric, and if you get it out to the newspaper first that this is going to tax the poor people and all of this, that immediately you got people coming up and questioning whether it's a good bill or not. It didn't tax food, it didn't tax mortgages, it didn't tax medicine or medical services. All the essentials of life were basically not taxable under that, and food was not taxable. But people had a hard time understanding that, and at the same time we had an income tax reduction so that the tax system basically was in balance. And somewhere along the line that still needs to be done, but I don't think we're going to see it now out of this group. Totally different type of organization. Neil, great cheerleader. I think, and a lot of fun to work with. And I think he also acted in a bipartisan way in a lot of issues, but there was never a doubt that he was a Democrat. And but I always enjoyed working with him, and I think he had a great respect for a lot of the Republicans who tried to work on a lot of the issues, because we were still coming out of the recession at that time. It was really towards the end of his governorship that the economy basically started to turn a little bit better. So Oregon does not come out of the recessions very fast. It usually goes in last but comes out last. Neil basically had a lot of lieutenants working around and a very vigorous staff, Vic was more of a quiet manager. Surrounded himself with very good people. Both of them did. In fact, all the governors have had very good people. Tom McCall had some, Ron Smith, and a few of those folks, outstanding people. Anybody who criticizes the state government should really look at who's working in it, because they really get some pretty good people for a pretty cheap price. And they were different kinds of. Neil worked a lot on trying to get large things going. A lot of ideas, and then you had to sort of sort through which ones were really workable. Vic would not do that. Vic would be a little bit more cautious on, because he had to be. He didn't have the money to do it, so he was basically trying to manage the shortfalls in the various agencies so things would keep running. And that was a much different thing that Neil sort of didn't have to worry quite as much about that towards the end. I think they were good on both sides. I think both governors worked well with the legislative process. Well, Neil was always more aggressive about things he wanted. Vic was probably more quiet, sort of bring the folks together in the office and talk about it. Neil would come probably down and talk to you. Neil had had a lot of contact with the legislative process when he was mayor of Portland. He was in our caucuses a lot talking about various plans for Portland. So I think he knew the legislative process pretty well. Barbaro basically, I think, had probably the greatest amount of legislative experience besides Vic coming in. And also, had the tough job of trying to sell a major tax reform. She probably had a greater appreciation for the educational process. And I think that came as much from being married to Frank, but she had a very strong dedication to that and to the human resource services. And she did not have an easy time with the legislature. I think at that particular time we were in this different kind of psychology type of thing. I don't know why it's changed for John. I don't know if it has changed for John. John sat before me in the in the House, and we became very good friends. In fact, we became a small group during those tough times that often would go out to dinner and talk. The Nancy Riles, Vera Katz, John, myself, a few people from outside the press came in just to have good conversation, but we also ended up talking about statewide problems. John is a tremendous policy-oriented person. And that's one of the reasons I always enjoyed being around him, because he was always dealing with policy. I think the Oregon Health Plan is a good example of that. And the fact that he's always been supportive of trying to get a better tax system in place and things along those lines. Now, as far as how legislators feel about him, as I felt about the governors I served with, I don't know how they're going to mark him in history, but I think that the current legislature has been much more difficult to deal with for John. I think that it is and I'll say that more from the House side than probably maybe from the Senate side, because I think the Senate has been a little bit more, have a little bit more of an ability, maybe because maybe more veterans over there, of sitting down with the governor and talking over issues than the House has been, which has been a little bit more contentious. But governors need to have legislatures who are willing to sit down and work with them, because they don't get their programs through or their ideas through unless you have that. In a lot of cases, almost organically, what you would do is one of the benefits of having lunch together up in the lounge with no interference from anybody else, or on the floor after a recess, groups gathering around a desk or gathering around a luncheon table would probably bring together those people that were interested in a particular subject, both parties, and you would talk about it and you'd argue among yourselves. And of course, you had to be careful that if you were all from the same committee, you didn't break the meeting's rules. So somebody would take a hike if there was anything like that occurring. But I think most of the time it wasn't somebody coming along and saying, follow me, but more or less getting together organically over the issue. It started to change, I think, probably in the late 80s and up through maybe even now, but it started to change and it became, I saw more out-of-state influence in issues starting to raise its ugly head. I saw more national committees interjecting their so-called political experts into the scenes. I started receiving cassette tapes on what was wrong with this country starting in '87, paid for by Newt Gingrich, that went to every Republican legislator in the United States. Okay? Very polished, very smooth presentations. I must have turned about 40 or 50 of those over to the political science department for future research on propaganda. Okay? That had a great influence on a lot of young legislators coming into the scene. And also sort of developed the attitude, if you aren't with me, you're against me. Okay? Caucuses turned into almost chastising individuals that didn't go along with the view. Okay? So if there was somebody who really basically felt that, this was a bad bill, it was a bad bill for them, they got, sort of shoved aside. Almost the silent treatment, if not even some outside, just plain nastiness. That started to occur. And it changed, I think, the whole attitude of the legislature. It became more highly partisan. I think more so on our side, maybe even than on the Democratic side. I think it led to far more demagoguery. I can remember one particular legislator whose basic feeling about state employees became so vigorous on the on the legislative floor, that even some of the other members of the same party, our party, got up and took him to task. It was that kind of a thing that was occurring. And I see remnants of that today. The handful of us tried to basically, say, this wasn't really the way we ought to be going to the leadership. Sometimes we were listened to, sometimes we weren't. But one thing that they basically couldn't control is they couldn't control how we voted. And so a lot of us who basically disagreed on issues still voted what we thought was the best. I wasn't there as co-chair of Ways and Means Committee in '93. I got through the first session in '91 basically because the handful of us that didn't quite disagree with everything or agree with everything basically wouldn't support the speakership if we didn't really get some credibility and some feeling that we were going to be. So some of us got positions that we wanted, and immediately after there was greater numbers, that changed. And so the chairmanship was lost in '93 to the Ways and Means Committee. Under the first chancellor that came to the legislature, which would have been Llewellyn, I think higher ed basically was just marching along on a fairly even keel. Okay. Then you went to a couple of new chancellors, Davis and such, that had a harder time because they got caught in the budget cut period. Higher ed, for some reason, has a tougher time. There's more sympathy towards K through 12. community colleges have grown tremendously through some very excellent leadership, and actually in many cases did a better job than higher education in presenting their case before the legislature. There used to be the statement that higher ed came in and whined about the money that they wanted. Community colleges came in with a definite plan, and everybody was behind it 100%. So there wasn't any community college president coming in and saying, I didn't get my fair piece. They had already agreed with that kind of thing. Higher ed tended to be more of the individual institutions sometimes being overly aggressive about their approach to who should get what, and trying to make sure that everyone was treated fairly in the process. Particularly hard in budget cut times when you have got more students and everything like that coming into the process. The greatest difficulty was that between the period of about 1979, 1980 up to now, Oregon has grown almost 30% in people, and yet people don't understand that those also call for more services and things like that to handle those. Most of my 17 years in Ways and Means, I didn't get an opportunity to put a lot of legislation. I was working on budgets, and basically the budgets were grinding out who were the good managers and who were not so good managers, okay? And what things could be lost in a budget cut time and which things could not. Higher ed, probably the only claim to fame that any of us in education could make at that time is we probably kept more pain from not being extracted from higher education than some people would have liked to have extracted from it. It didn't gain a lot. In fact, it kept its nose basically level. But there were people who basically wanted to take a lot more from higher education. So all I say is that we probably reduced the pain level and kept the wheels on the car, but that's about all. And the institutions were struggling with that. The yo-yo effect of up and down budgets just does not work very well either for K through 12 community colleges or universities. And that, I think, has been the toughest item to sell to the Oregon public, is that they have not recognized that we have a very strong commitment in at least of those of us who have been here for a long time, even though we're transported Californians, that we have an obligation to education in the state and we have an obligation to services. And the key question has been, is always, what services should government pay for? Okay, $64 question in about 15 parts. Okay, and nobody will really sit down and analyze that and really say, yes, we should be paying for state police. We should be paying for roads. We should be paying for even the Oregon Historical Society. We should be paying for a portion of public broadcasting. We should be paying for mental health. But nobody will sit down and say, let's do that. John Kitzhaber tried it at the end of the '93 session. He got the leadership from both parties together, and we sat down in that interim period and started to work on it. It was immediately abandoned after he left. No longer gained any interest. It's a hard question because what it does is it brings you directly in focus of what needs to be done and what people really want to pay for, and they like the services when they get them, but they sure don't want to really pay for them when they're here. And I don't know if that is being diluted by a lot of the people who have come into the state who basically come from other places and don't have that, what I call, feeling towards education, or at least the institutions that we pride in Oregon. And whether because they have got their children grown, they come from places that don't like taxes, more conservative in their viewpoint, basically now have shifted the power base in the state of Oregon, which comes out in people like the Sizemores and the McIntyres and so on down the line, who simply just don't like paying for anything. Don't believe it's a public obligation that the society needs to have and pay for its services. And I don't know how you solve that, because when we got into school taxation, one of the big issues is one of the toughest issues you faced in the equalization formula was that you had districts out there that had great tax bases, but they had a constituency that didn't like to pay for the schools. You had poor districts where the constituency made every effort to pay for the schools. You had rich districts that basically made high commitments, the Beavertons, the Corvalises, the Eugenes, so on. How to devise a system that didn't reward those who didn't like education was one of the real tough things. And when ballot measure 5 came along, what happened was you simply reduced the taxes of those people who didn't want to pay taxes anyway for schools. And then when you came along and gave the mission to the legislature to distribute the funds through the distribution formula, those districts got windfalls through the equalization process. And under the claim that they wanted to be like the good school systems, put in music programs and history and all of the rest of the things that they had to eliminate from their curriculum, they tended to bank the money and not put those programs in. Okay? So now we have out there some little districts that have got a lot of money laying in the bank left from the equalization process. You got the big districts that are really having to cut heart and soul out of their particular school system. So the answer doesn't lie in just a new taxation system. It's also maybe looking back at trying to reevaluate how we distribute the funds, if we're going to still do it by the legislative process rather than by some form of local control. There was nothing wrong with local control. What was wrong was the automatic 6% increase that really got some of the people up in arms and killed the goose that laid the golden egg. Well, this will probably go down in history, but I would say it's probably limited right now due to the fact that you don't have people in here with enough of the historical background of taxation and education in it that they could even carry a message out to the public about it. So likelihood is going to have to be done by the public themselves from the outside, by outstanding leadership of people who might be willing to do that. The term limits have not helped, and I hope that people reject it soundly this time, because what people never heard before was that there was always about a 20% turnover in the legislature every few years. Very few people, you can count on one hand, people who have stayed longer than 10 years. The few of us that did basically stayed on because it was a crisis at that particular time, or I probably would have left after about 10 or 12 years. So term limits basically was, I think, a bad piece of legislation. Will remain so, and I'm hoping that there is not either enough signatures or it will not progress to the ballot this time, but if it does, if it will be people who voted for it before will think about it. And under that particular scenario, what you get is legislators who come in knowing that they've got a limited amount of time. Their interest is not on educating themselves over a lot of years in the legislative process about what goes into a good tax measure. And taxation is a terribly complicated. In fact, I think that I'd put every new legislator on one of the tax committees in their first session. I'd keep them there for a couple of sessions before they'd ever see a budget. And in that way, they'd gain a great appreciation on the basis of where we get the money to do what we got to do. Then when you go in to deal with budgets, you'll appreciate where the money's coming from much more, and be able to really deal with the budgets in a much more fair manner. But I don't see any way that the legislature is going to be able to deal with that under the current situation. I think we need more Mr. Moyer's type programs on OPB, maybe with an Oregon twist to it, rather than, because those are the kind of shows that, and we got to get them maybe on some other stations too, that really sort of point out some of the key issues in the state. The media is the answer, really, and the media in the state, I think, has picked up this stuff in spots. You know, the question is how to pick it up in a concerted effort. And then I have to admit, we have some coffee shop and reporters around that don't do their homework either, and that complicates the process. Well, at the first session, you're not very effective, I don't think, but you're wondering where the bathrooms are in the place and everything else. But I think it takes at least 3 sessions in the area of revenue and budgets to become fully aware of the budgetary or the taxation area. It's the hardest area, other than those that might be dealing with the legislative law, such as the Judiciary Committee. But they're basically looking at stuff that lawyers deal with all the time, and they're very familiar with that, and they're making crucial calls on it. But taxation is something you just don't pick up very easily. Most people don't know the difference between a deduction and a tax credit. If you ask the ordinary citizen on the street and you say, I'm going to give you a deduction on your taxes, and they say, oh, great. They say, do you know the difference between that and tax credit? No. Did you know you'd get more in a tax credit? No, I didn't know that. Most of them don't know that. They didn't know the difference between levies and bond issues. Those are issues, serial levies. They don't get acquainted with because they don't have to do that anymore, because that's been more or less eliminated from the process. Now we scramble for bond issues and local options and things like that, and those are tough to understand too. So I think at least 2 terms before you start to really become somewhat effective. Some jump in with a whole pile of bills that they got into the hopper. They learn quickly that putting a lot of bills isn't the answer to being a good legislator. Well, it's gone from about running a campaign for about $7,000 up to over $100 for a job that pays about $12. Okay, not very sensible. Much more, I think, much more beholden to large contributions. You start looking now for the $2,000 to $5,000 to $10,000 contributions, and it takes an awful lot of $25 and $50 ones to bring you up to where you can have a fighting chance to do what you need to do. I never liked that portion anyway. I thought I didn't enjoy campaigning, and I didn't enjoy fundraising. In fact, I didn't do any. After the first session, I didn't do any fundraising. I'm sorry to say, I had such a good district. I sat back and people sent in contributions, and that was enough to run my campaign, and off I went. I had a real fortunate deal. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know if it is or not. Maybe if these people were here a longer period of time, the personalities would either change or be slightly altered, or maybe stay the same. You know, I don't know. I do think that over an entire legislative career, you will make probably 20, 25 really close friends. But you will have developed a reputation from the rest of them based on whether you did your homework, whether you basically kept your word on any particular thing you were going to do. You probably gain a lot of respect by the fact that you were thoughtful about what you did and kind to your other fellow legislators. So I think you develop that kind of feeling by how you do your work. And if you do your work well, you gain that respect which lasts the entire time you're in the legislature. And I think a lot of them did. I think it was a lot of them there did that in the early years. Well, it should never gotten started in the first place. I have to fault the media for making them, because the media did make them. They gave them far more publicity than they deserved. they probably never really did a full expose on where these people were coming from. The fact that they weren't public education fans to start with. That the fact that their children didn't go to public schools, that they had somewhat questionable past as far as their business dealings, and where were their interest in taxation? Why did they want to get taxation relief? Those kind of things basically didn't come out in a lot of the precedent, but they certainly get the press every time they show up down here threatening the legislature that if the legislature doesn't do what they want, that they will start an initiative on this or that. And by the way, that's one thing I'd change. I wouldn't get rid of the initiative process. I'd make sure that no initiative could be a constitutional amendment. So it would allow the legislature to at least sometime in the future to fine-tune it, because that's the thing that's really killing us right now. We can't go back and fine-tune those things without overturning them. And so your hands are basically locked. They knew that. That was very clever on their part. And they basically have got sort of a stranglehold on us in that. Well, I think we've gone pretty far in the initiative process. I'm hoping that it's more or less cooling down a little bit. That people are beginning to see that simply signing a signature on a paper has a little bit more of a obligation than just walking away from it, and that some of these are not well written, and they don't really know what's in there very often because they don't take the time to read the fine print. And that, I think, if that would cool down a little bit, I think it would put a little bit more credibility into, or at least allow the legislature to do what they should be doing. Now the question is, if they don't do that, then the initiative process comes back into a very strong force. And if people feel like the legislature is not a quality legislature, I think then you'll see the rise of initiatives again. Well, one is they better know what they're getting into, first of all. They better also know who they are from the standpoint of what they stand for, so that they can stand up in any kind of a caucus situation and say, this is where I am and this is the way I'm going to vote. And I think they would be wise to really study the major issues and know something about taxation and know something about human resource services and where the money goes in those services. A lot of people don't know where the money goes in the human resource area. And so they need to know those things. And if they do those, they can at least come in halfway knowledgeable. I talked to one candidate this year, and I told that person, I said, you also have to realize that you may not like the people you're serving with. You may step into a caucus in which you do not agree with. How are you going to act on that if you don't agree with them? And that's a tough question, because the pressures are tremendous, and you're getting pressures from every side, and if you listen to lobbyists too much, you can be in dangerous territory. And how to distinguish between a good lobbyist and a bad lobbyist, those are things you need to know.
The fact of the matter is that we have reached a point in state government where tax reform is of prime concern, brought about not only by ballot measure 5, but brought about by the economic condition of the state of Oregon with the loss of such things as our forest products industry and such. And when you think of what we've done this session, of the reduction in schools and some of the reductions that have taken place in budgets and the reorganization things that we have done, there really is only one way to go, and to try to emphasize that to the voters of the state of Oregon is to deal with tax reform. And tax reform is a balancing of that tax system, and a sales tax that's in the Constitution will do that.
I've been in public service for a long time, starting back with working in the State Board of Forestry as a student. I guess I got a whale of an education in the legislature. I have to say that that I could not have really had a more comprehensive view of state government than serving in the Oregon legislature. And I was very fortunate to having been put on Ways and Means, which was as well as revenue. which I think were two committees that really deal with, let's say, 70 to 80% of the state's issues. And I think that it has fostered, at least an interest in continuing in some sort of public service. I feel a strong responsibility to continue harping about taxation. And I have enjoyed working in the environmental area when the governor asked me to be on the Environmental Quality Commission. That's been another education, by the way, because I was not deeply involved in DEQ efforts other than their budgets. I've always been a fan of public broadcasting, and I was very happy to be able to go on that. I was not a governor's appointee on that one, but and they are facing tough budget situation. And locally, the Riverfront Commission turned out to be a little bit more than we bargained for. It became a very controversial area over the cutting down of some trees, which were not so great after all. We didn't cut down very many. But a real battleground where we had to go back to the ballot box to finally resolve it. But that's going to be, I think, a contribution to the community. Currently, I was on the Parking Commission still, but I'll go off on that soon. And I'm on the City Hall Renovation Committee. And I'm wondering why I don't get a regular job and get regular pay. My thesis was on time management, and I think I learned something from it. I became a pretty good time manager. I really map out stuff pretty closely. And I think that's one thing you have to do in the legislative process. You have to learn to be a good time manager. And when I was in the legislature, I essentially had 3 jobs. I had my placement director's job eventually when I finished up down at Oregon State. I had my teaching my forestry courses, and I was doing legislative work. And so you're juggling this stuff all the time, and so you learn to be pretty good at managing time. I think I had the respect of the community for what I accomplished. Got a few good measures out. I liked working on 1.5% for art and historic preservation and some of those things and the taxation issues. But I don't know. I would just hope. I always felt that one of the things I didn't want to do is be an embarrassment to the person I lost to, or who lost to me in an election. I felt if they could walk away saying, I'm glad I lost to me, Tony Van Vliet, then I'd say, I'd done a reasonable job. Free time, we spend an awful lot of time visiting with our grandkids because we have 2 of the families in Portland. And by the way, there's where I come to grips with the education program because they're both in very good schools, but they're both facing budget crunches. And we do spend a little time down a little piece of property down on Lobster Creek where Courtney brought his family, but he didn't fish. And I don't get to paint enough. I wish I had more time for my watercolors.